Hey guys, in this lesson we will see how we can generate simple IDs with using JPA and Hibernate. You know that we use IDs to identify our table records and this allows us to reach the records effectively. The JPA specification supports four different primary key generation strategies which generate the primary key values programmatically or use database features like auto-incremented columns or sequences. Now we will see all of these strategies with examples. Let's start with the default strategy. To do it, first of all, we will create an example model class. First of all, it will have Java persistence table annotation because we describe it as a database table. Then we should add entity annotation to describe it as an entity class. Then we will add lombok data annotation to generate getter and setter methods of our class fields. Our first field will be ID. To describe it as an ID column, we will add ID annotation. To generate ID field automatically, we will add generated value annotation. In here, our generated strategy will be default. The generated type auto is the default generation type. It selects a generation strategy based on the database specific dialect. For example, in our example, we will use MySQL and MySQL will choose sequence strategy. But if we use another database, it can be an identity strategy or sequence strategy. Okay, let's create another field for it like name, string name. Now to save it, we will create a JPA repository class. JPA repository is an abstract class implemented by Spring JPA repository. With JPA repository, Spring will handle basic CRUD database operations automatically, like save, update, find by ID, etc. JPA repository has two generic parameters. First parameter is for the model class. The second parameter is for the ID class of the model class. So our model class will be default one and our ID class will be long. Okay, now we can test it. To test it, we can create unit tests for each case. Of course, we will use Spring Boot test. Under the test source, we can create our package and our test class. Then we will inject our repository class. We can inject it with using auto-wired annotation in Spring. Then we can create a test method. Our test method will be to save entity with test name. Now we can run it. After running it, we can see the SQL logs on the console. To show it, our property is Spring JPA show SQL will be true. When we check, auto strategy uses Hibernate sequence table to generate it. We can also check database. Okay, let's check our second ID generator. To check it, we will create another entity class like default one. Actually, we can directly copy and paste it from default one. Then we can change the table name and class name. Our second ID generator is identity. It relies on an auto-incremented database column and lets the database generate a new value with each insert operation. This is very efficient because the auto-incremented columns are highly optimized and it doesn't require any additional statements. Now we can create JPA repository for it to test it. JPA repository has two generic parameters. First parameter is for the model class and the second parameter is for the ID class of model class. Now let's test it. First of all, we will inject our repository class with auto-wired. Then we can create a test method like default one. Our test method will be to save entity with test name. Now we can run it. After running it, we can see the SQL logs on the console. When we check the logs, we couldn't see the ID field on insert query because ID will be provided as default value on database table. We can see it on create table SQL. Also, we can check it from database. When we check the database, we will see the ID field as auto-increment. Okay, let's check our third ID generator. To check it, we will create another entity class like default one. Actually, we can directly copy and paste it from previous default one class. Then we can edit it. We can change the table name and class name of it. Our third ID generator is seconds. It uses database sequence to generate primary key. It requires additional select statement to get the next value from a database sequence. But this has no performance effect for most applications. So it is optimized. When we don't specify the generator name, Hibernate uses default sequence generator, or we can use specific sequence generator with using sequence generator annotation. The sequence generator annotation lets us define the name of the generator, the name of the database sequence, and the allocation size of the sequence. In here, default allocation size is 50. We can think it like session increment value. If we use batch inserting, that can be meaningful, but I suggest to use it as 1. By the way, MySQL does not have sequence type. It behaves like a table generator. Now we can create JPA repository. JPA repository has two generic parameters. First parameter is the first parameter is the model class, and second parameter is the ID class of model class. Now let's test it. First of all, we will inject it with using auto-wired. Then we can create it. Then we can create the test method like previous one. Our test method will be to save entity with test name. Now we can run it. After running it, we can see the SQL logs on the console. When we check the logs, we can see our sequence table update query to get next value. Like I said before, MySQL does not have a sequence type. It creates a table to store sequence values. Of course, it is not effective because sequence type is optimized for ID generation. We can check it also from database. Okay, let's check our last ID generator. To check it, we will create another entity class like default one. Actually, we can directly copy and paste it from default one. Then we can change the table name. Our last ID generator is table. It simulates a sequence by storing and updating its current value in a database table, which requires the use of pessimistic locks, which put all transactions into a sequential order. This slows down our application, so it is not preferable generator. When we don't specify the generator name, Hibernate uses default table generator, or we can use specific table generator. The table generator annotation lets us define the name of the generator, the name of the database table, and the allocation size of the table. Now we can create the JPA repository for it to test it. JPA repository has two generic parameters. First parameter is for the model class, and the second parameter is for the ID class of the model class. Now let's test it. With using ID generator test class, we can copy and paste it from previous test methods. We will save entity with test name, but we forgot to inject repository class. Let's inject it with using auto-wires. Then we will save it with test name. Okay, now we can run it. After running it, we can see the SQL logs on the console. When we check the logs, we can see that our table generator update query to get next value. We can check it from database also, of course. Okay, now we learned ID generator types. You can ask me which strategy is best for me. I definitely say that if your database supports sequence generator, directly use it sequence generator. because it's very efficient and it supports batch insert and batch update. Otherwise, you can use identity generator. That's all from me. Thank you.